Hello, and welcome to Shakespeare in Context with Claire. I hope that you've seen part 1, The French Connection. If not, I suggest that you watch that video first, then this video will make more sense. We discussed allusions in the play to events on the continent in 1578. Much of this information was available in the records of the Elizabethan court day to day. In this video, we will be showing how the satire is not just about the events on the continent, but also about people and events in the Elizabethan court. We will find out how a visit to Audley End by the Queen's court and the representatives of Cambridge University in 1578 are alluded to, and how an address given by Gabriel Harvey gave us a clue to the characters represented in the play. Gabriel Harvey himself provides the source of amusement through the character of Holofernes. At the end of part 1, I asked whether your candidate was a good fit given the clues provided. I tried to create a table to see which of the authorship candidates was most suitable, but I soon found that this was an impossible task. But based on the strong evidence that the author was aware of the political situation abroad in 1578, let's look at who's in and who's out. So, who might have had insider info? According to tradition, Will of Stratford was just leaving school in 1578. It is unlikely that he would be privy to the political gossip at court. Christopher Marlowe was just starting his scholarship at the King's School in Canterbury. Between 1576 and 1579, Sir Francis Bacon was with the English ambassador to France, Sir Amias Paulet. Henri of Navarre had escaped from Paris early in 1576 without informing his wife Margaret, who remained in Paris until 1577. Paulet was in regular communication with Walsingham and Leicester. He sent to England designs for a new style of farthingale worn by Marguerite de Valois. It is likely that Bacon met, or at the very least saw Marguerite at court in Paris, and would have heard rumours of Henri of Navarre, who had escaped just prior to his arrival. From 1572, Sir Philip Sidney was travelling abroad. Sidney was in Paris for the marriage on the 18th of August of King Henri of Navarre and Marguerite de Valois, and for the elaborate celebrations that followed it. Sidney observed the St. Bartholomew Day massacre from the safety of Walsingham's embassy. In March 1577, he was introduced to Don John and Jean Cashmere to Palatine. A couple of months later, he went to Brabant to meet William of Orange. He was in regular communication with his uncle Leicester and his sister Mary Sidney, who was a member of the Queen's entourage. In 1578, he was with the Queen on her summer progress. In 1578, Henry Neville travelled to the continent with his tutor Henry Saville. The tour was more educational than diplomatic. His stepmother was Sir Francis Bacon's half-sister. John Florio grew up on the continent, receiving a humanist education in Germany. He moved to England in the early 1570s. In 1578, John Florio published First Fruits. He dedicated this work to Leicester and became involved with Leicester's theatre company. He described himself as a poor artisan. William Stanley VI, Earl of Derby, was a student in England in 1578. In 1582, he travelled to the continent to study in university towns in France, and may also have attended Henri of Navarre's academy at Nérac. Emilia Lania Bassano was born in 1569. So would only have been 9 years old in 1578. Roger Manners, Earl of Rutland, was born in 1576, so he would only have been 2 years old. Sir Walter Raleigh fought with the Huguenots in France in 1569. In 1577 and 79, he sailed to find the Northwest Passage. Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford, accompanied the Queen on her summer progress in 1578, so he would have known the court gossip in France and the Low Countries. He was welcomed at court in Paris in 1575 and 1576, where he met with Henri and Marguerite and François Duc d'Alençon. So, based on the evidence that the author was political situation on the continent in 1578, I have placed them as least likely to most likely to be the author of the play. But that's not the whole story. Let's see what's happening at home. In part 1 of Love's Labour's Lost, we found some parallels to real people on the continent, but the characters represented by the attendants to the King of Navarre and the princess were elusive. The King of Navarre had forsworn the company of women for 3 years to concentrate on study. There is a parallel with a statute issued by Queen Elizabeth on the 9th of August 1561. On a visit to Ipswich, Her Majesty found that in cathedrals and colleges there were so many wives, widows and children seen that it was tending to interrupt the studies of the scholars there. Therefore she issued an order to all dignitaries dated August 9th at Ipswich to forbid all resort of women to the ruins of cathedrals or colleges, and that, upon pain of losing their ecclesiastical promotions, after banning women from places of learning, within 3 years the Queen with all her retinue made a visit to Cambridge University. The Queen and all her maids of honour stayed in King's College, Cambridge. On her 1578 summer progress, Queen Elizabeth stayed at Audley End, where they received a delegation from Cambridge University. We can find in the records the men that accompanied her. It is more difficult to find out which ladies were with Her Majesty, as they are not mentioned. I have drawn up a list of some of the ladies that might have been with her. Gabriel Harvey gave an address in Latin to Queen Elizabeth, Leicester, Oxford, Hatton and Sidney. The work was later published. Gratulations, Validinensis. There are allusions throughout the plays to these 4 men. Gabriel Harvey himself seems to be lampooned as the character Holofernes. This is also the event in 1578 at which Gabriel Harvey said to Oxford, Vultus stella vibrat, or thy will Shakespeare's. A few days after the 1561 edict was proclaimed, the Queen went to stay at Hedingham Castle with the 16th Earl of Oxford. The young Edward de Vere may have been present to hear the Queen speak about this new rule. He was also with her when she broke the rule on her visits to Oxford and Cambridge universities a few years later. In 1578, the Queen's summer progress starts at the home of Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. But Leicester was not at home to receive her. He was on a visit to Elizabeth's cousin Mary, Queen of Scots. In a letter from Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, to Christopher Hatton, he refers to himself as her eyes. Dr. Richard Howland, Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, in a letter to William Cecil, Chancellor, discusses the giving of gifts and whether the representatives of the university should come before Her Majesty in black gowns or in scarlet. In his letter of reply, Burleigh asks that gloves be given to Lord Leicester, Robert Dudley, my Lord Chamberlain, Earl of Sussex, Thomas Radcliffe, my Lord of Oxford, Edward de Vere, and also Mr. Vice-Chamberlain, Christopher Hatton. Then in a later letter he suggests that the representatives of the university present themselves in long black gowns. Description in the university archive states, they came all to the court in their black gowns and hoods. Lord Burleigh, Leicester, Oxford and Hatton were all presented with gloves. More French ambassadors arrived a few days later. Whilst the Queen is wining and dining the French ambassadors, they heard news that there is a peace treaty. In the States Accord, the Duc d'Alençon is given the title Defender of the Liberties of the Low Countries against the tyranny of the Spaniards and their adherents. The Spanish ambassador Mendoza is still in London, writing to Philip II's secretary, with news of the ambassador's feast. The Queen was not happy that there was not as much plate as she would have liked. She called the Earl of Sussex, who was in charge of these matters. He replied that they were carrying more plate than usual. The Queen told him. She asked Lord North, who was present at the feast, whether he thought there was a lot or little plate. He replied that he thought there was very little, to throw the blame on Sussex. Hank Whitmore describes Thomas Radcliffe, 3rd Earl of Sussex, as a man of courage, bluntness, intellect and empathy. 24 years Oxford senior, he would become a father figure, mentor, colleague, friend and close ally to Oxford, in mutual antipathy towards Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Mendoza continues in his letter. The next day the Queen sent twice to tell the Earl of Oxford, who is a very gallant lad, to dance before the ambassadors, whereupon he replied that he hoped Her Majesty would not order him to do so, as he did not want to entertain Frenchmen. When the Lord Steward took him the message the second time, he replied that he would not give pleasure to Frenchmen, nor listen to such a message, and with that he left the room. It seems as though he had heard the attempt the previous day to show off in front of the Frenchmen, for which his friend and mentor was chastised. Otherwise, I think he might have been happy to join in the dancing. Edward de Vere eventually left the Progress in September, when 8 carts were ordered to carry his stuff. The Queen continued on her progress. Various masks were presented along the way. One being the show of Chastity, Dame Chastity and her maids, called Modesty, Temperance, Good Exercise, and Shamefastness, set upon Cupid and took away his bow and quiver of arrows. Chastity gave the Queen Cupid's bow, to learn to shoot at whom she pleased, since none could wound Her Highness's heart. In part 1, we discussed these words by Boyet, alluding to French affairs. The author is also alluding to English affairs, and one love affair in particular. The Queen's great love affair with Robert Dudley was beginning to cool in the mid to late 1570s. Fairest of fair is a phrase used about Queen Elizabeth. Also she was called Prince. The Queen called Leicester her eyes, a word used repeatedly by Boyet here. So the Princess and the King represent the real King of Navarre and his wife, the Princess de Valois, but they also refer to Queen Elizabeth and Leicester. In 1575, Leicester made a last great effort to secure the Queen's hand in marriage. He spent thousands of pounds repairing and beautifying Kenilworth Castle, a gift from the Queen herself, ready for her visit. Leicester, puffed up with his own pride and self-importance, portrayed himself as Arthur and claimed to be a descendant of the ancient king, as did Elizabeth's own father. Being met at the gate with a fanfare, the Lady of the Lake offered the lake, the lodge, the lord at the Queen's disposal. Elizabeth replied to the lady, "It pleased Her Highness to thank this lady, and to add withal, we had thought indeed that the lake had been ours, and do you call it yours now?" Leicester's efforts by claiming Arthurian roots and thus putting himself on a par with Elizabeth were quickly put down. The planned entertainments of love and marriage were ignored by Elizabeth, who refused to watch. At the same time of these entertainments, she was already in negotiation with Catherine de' Medici for an alliance with France by marriage to the Duc d'Alençon. All his behaviours did make their retire to the court of his eye, peeping through desire. His heart like an agate with your print impressed, proud with his form, in his eye pride expressed. his tongue all impatient to speak and not see, did stumble with haste in his eyesight to be. All senses to that sense did make their repair, to feel only looking on fairest of fair. By 1578, Leicester was fed up of waiting for Elizabeth and was angered by her marriage negotiations. In September 1578, he secretly married Lettice Knowles. The author of the play seems to be unaware of the secret marriage. That Leicester, her eyes, was only looking on fairest of fair. The Queen was often described as the fairest. She even wrote a poem describing herself as fair. When I was fair and young, then favour graced me. Of many ways was I sought their mistress for to be. Boyet says, I'll give you Aquitaine and all that is his, and you give him for my sake but one loving kiss. All that was Leicester's was in Elizabeth's power to take back. In Philip Sidney's 1575 Lady of May, the character Rhombus, a pedant, much like Holofernes, says the following: I have found unum par, a pair, pasticorum bedorum, of Papistian beads, cum quos, with the which, omnium dierum, every day, next after his paternoster, he semper saith, and Elizabeth, as many lines as there be beads on this string. The Queen, fluent in Latin, would not have needed the phrase-by-phrase translation provided by the pompous Rhombus. Elizabeth Hodgson, in Grief and Women Writers, states, the pedantic schoolmaster in Philip Sidney's 1578 entertainment, The Lady of May, offers to Elizabeth this gift of papisticorum bedorum, an agate necklace that he calls Robert Dudley's rosary, for his prayers to Father, Son, Holy Ghost, and England's Queen. The July 9th entry in the Elizabethan court day to day, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, writes, One thing hath troubled me not a little, to hear that her Majesty should come to Wanstead, and her eyes not be there to receive her. I fear that little liking to it she had before will through too many more faults breed her less love hereafter. If my wishing could have served, yea, or a little sooner, knowing of it, had come, I think Saint Anne should have had a short farewell. But God grant I may hear that her Majesty doth both well rest and find all things there to her good contentment, and that the good man Robert she last heard of there were found at his beads with all his aves in his solitary walk. In The Lady of May the words and Elizabeth replace the usual Ave Maria. Leicester wants the Queen to know that he is worshipping her with his agate beads and his aves. The author, in the words of Boyet, expresses that Leicester offers the Queen words. He has nothing of substance to offer her that isn't already hers, as jewels in crystal for some prince to buy, who tendering their own worth from where they were glassed, did point you to buy them along as you passed. I'll give you Aquitaine and all that is his, and you give him for my sake but one loving kiss. The author of The Lady of May, Sir Philip Sidney, is represented as one of the King of Navarre's attendants. Longueville reads his poem aloud. Did not the heavenly rhetoric of thine eye, gainst whom the world cannot hold argument, persuade my heart to this false perjury? Vows for thee broke deserve not punishment. A woman I forswore, but I will prove, thou being a goddess, I for thee not. My vow was earthly, thou a heavenly love. Thy grace being gained cures all disgrace in me. Do you think that this style of Longueville's poem is reminiscent of Philip Sidney? Here is the opening address of the Lady of May. to most gracious chagrin, to one whose state is raised over all, whose faith does oft the bravest sort enchant, whose mind is such the wisest minds appall, who in oneself these diverse gifts can plant. How dare I wretch to seek there my woes to rest, where ears be burnt, eyes dazzled, hearts oppressed. This is how Barone, who is hiding in a tree, responds when he hears Longueville's poem. This is the liver vein which makes flesh a deity, a green goose a goddess. Pure idolatry. God amend us, we are much out the way. Giordano Bruno, in the Heroic Frenzies addressed to Sir Philip Sidney, says, "It is truly, O most noble sir, the works of low, brutish, and filthy nature to become the constant admirer, to have attached devoted thought to or around the beauty of a woman's body. Good God," he continues in his argument, "that it is ignoble to take on the affections of love and use one's brain to write about it." He argues that women, even beautiful women, are still women. They are not goddesses. Hence it is idolatry to praise them. Gabriel Harvey, pedant, not known for romantic poetry, was teased for his feelings towards Philip Sidney. In the 1578 eulogy by Gabriel Harvey to Philip Sidney, he proclaims, "Sum Jaco, I am all liver." The phrase cogit amare Jaco, the liver knows how to love, becomes a refrain in later satiric treatments of Harvey, beginning with Pedantius in 1581. Philip Sidney loved his nickname Signy, or Swan, but in Love's Labour's Lost, instead of Swan, he's been called a goose, a green goose. The Lady of May was Sidney's first known work. Perhaps Shakespeare is making fun of Sidney's inexperience, his greenness at writing an entertainment for the Queen. It is obvious to his audience that the character of Holofernes is a pedant. It needs no explanation. Whereas Sidney's pedant Rhombus announces himself, "I am potentissima domina," a schoolmaster, that is to say, a pedagogue, one not a little versed in the disciplinating of the juvenile fry, wherein I use such geometrical proportion. Maria says, "Longueville, I know him, madam, at a marriage feast between Lord Perigord and the beauteous heir of Jack Falconbridge, solemnized in Normandy. I saw this Longueville." Henri Navarre became Count Perigord at the death of his mother, just prior to the wedding to Marguerite de Valois, attended by Philip Sidney. I haven't been able to find out what is meant here by the beauteous heir of Lord Falconbridge. Maria describes Longueville. A man of sovereign parts he is esteemed, well fitted in arts, glorious in arms. Nothing becomes him ill that he would well. The only soil of his fair virtue's gloss, if virtue's gloss will stain with any soil, is a sharp wit, blunt a will, whose edge hath power to cut, whose will still wills. It should none spare that come within his power. This seems a fitting description of Sidney, who is said to have returned from France with the manners of a prince, praised for his glories on the battlefield, but had lately turned to artistic pursuits, when in 1578 he was prevented by the Queen from going off to serve abroad. He was described as having a sharp wit. So if Longueville was Sidney, who was Domain? On the 11th of November, 1577, Christopher Hatton was appointed Vice-Chamberlain of the royal household and sworn into the Privy Council. He was soon knighted. In June 1578, the Queen formally granted him the Bishop of Ely's house in Ely Place, Holborn, despite the vigorous protests of the bishop. These appointments, together with the valuable grants which the Queen showered him, prompted rumours that he was her lover. A tall, shapely man, the Queen was much taken with his dancing. Some thought him a bad influence on the Queen, and only rose to power because of his tall, slender physique and his dancing. Catherine says of Domain, "Most power to do most harm, least knowing ill, for he hath wit to make an ill shape good, and shape to win grace, though he had no wit. I saw him at the Duke d'Alençon's once." Hatton was one of the councillors appointed to negotiate the marriage with the Duke d'Alençon, which he did even though he disagreed with the match. There was undoubtedly a close personal relationship between him and the Queen. When he became ill, the Queen visited him every day. He had ideas above his station. In correspondence, the Queen called him her lids, and he referred to himself in a letter to her as sheep. Catherine and Boyet repeat the word sheep. Later, in a witty exchange between Moth and Holofernes, they discuss letters of the alphabet. What is a B spelled backwards? Ba, a most silly sheep. The last 4 letters, if you repeat them, the 5th if I will repeat them, A-E-I. The sheep, the other 2, concludes it O-U. It reminds me of the fustian riddle, M-O-A-I, in Twelfth Night. M-O-A-I doth sway my life. If this fall into the hand, revolve. As we have already discussed, Malvolio is thought to be modelled on Hatton. Let's have a look at another riddle. The fox, the ape, and the humble bee were still at odds, being but 3, until the goose came out the door, staying the odds by adding 4. The address which Gabriel Harvey gave on the Queen's progress to Audley End in 1578 was reported to have been only made to the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. The Latin speech, Gratulationis Validnensis, consists of 4 books, the first addressed to the Queen, the second to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the third to Lord Burleigh, and the 4th to the Earl of Oxford, Sir Christopher Hatton, and Philip Sidney. It is these men, honoured by Cambridge University in 1578, that Eva Turner Clarke thinks might be the English equivalent for the attendants to the King of Navarre. It's here that I come back to the riddle. The fox, or renard, could be an epithet applied to Lord Burleigh. In the allegorical poem Mother Hubbard's Tale by Edmund Spenser, the fox is William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and the ape is thought to be his son, Robert, or Simier. Simier was nicknamed Ape by Queen Elizabeth. In the Machiavellianism of Gabriel Harvey by T.H. Jameson in 1941, commenting on Gabriel Harvey's volume, he says the next book, addressed to the deep and fox-like Burleigh. Sir Christopher Hatton was from a humble background, from the village of Holdenby. He was always buzzing around, busying himself with the Queen's business. Holdenby, Humbleby? Moth says, what is B spelled backwards? Bar, a most silly sheep. Hatton was nicknamed Sheep by Elizabeth. The last one, Philip Sidney, was known by the French as Sidney, swan, from which he took his symbol. Instead of the graceful swan, a silly goose is substituted. Costard says, "Oh, marry me to one Francis. I smell some l'envoi, some goose in this." In 1583, Philip Sidney married Frances, 16-year-old daughter of Sir Francis Walsingham. If this rhyme is about the Alençon match, the fox William Cecil was in favour of the match, which the ape Simier, d'Alençon's man, was there to negotiate, and Hatton, the humble bee, who Elizabeth instructed to negotiate for the match, was actually against it. Therefore, they were at odds. Notice that when the goose came out the door, it didn't make a total of 4, but added 4. Philip Sidney, the goose, came out of the door, or exposed his feelings of opposition to the match, along with Leicester and Walsingham and Pembroke. Simier arrived at court in January 1579. It is thought that the early version of this play was devised prior to his visit and presented at court, named as a masque of knights and amazons. Apart from the Earl of Oxford, the other Earl who was on the progress with Elizabeth in 1578, who was in favour of the match, was Thomas Radcliffe, 3rd Earl of Sussex. The monument to the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Radcliffe Earls of Sussex has an ape wearing a cap of maintenance as a footrest. A person who wears the cap of maintenance is a representative of the monarch. In the lineup of lords addressed in Harvey's Gratulationes Valdinensis, we have the Earl of Leicester, represented by the King of Navarre, Sir Philip Sidney, represented by Longueville, and Sir Christopher Hatton as Dumaine. Who is the Earl represented by Baron? It is, of course, Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. It seems that the Queen's Progress of 1578 features quite strongly in Love's Labour's Lost. But why did the men dress up as Muscovites? This portrait of Sir Thomas Smith might give us a clue. He is shown here wearing a loose black gown trimmed with dark fur. Sable and other fur was imported from Russia. Ivan IV of Russia, known to us as Ivan the Terrible, established close trading links with England in the early 1550s, when the Muscovy Company was formed. The king reads Armado's, which starts, "So it is besieged with sable-coloured melancholy," and ends, "But to the place where it standeth north-north-east, and by east from west corner of thy curious knotted garden." In 1551, company of merchant adventurers to new lands, 3 ships set off from London, sailing north-north-east for the first expedition in 1555 to find the north-east passage to China. The ships were separated in a storm. Only the Edward Bonaventure made it, dropping anchor at the mouth of the Dvina River. Later, Ivan built a fort there, which is curiously shaped like a knotted garden. England imported furs and exported English woollens, russets and kerseys. Baron says, "And I will wish thee never more to dance, nor never more in Russian habit wait. I do forswear them, and I here protest. Henceforth my wooing mind shall be expressed in russet yeas and honest kersey nose." So why did the 4 disguise themselves like Muscovites? In the arrangements for the visit to Audley End, Burleigh suggests that the representatives of the university present themselves in long black gowns. Description in University Archive states, "They came all to the court in their black gowns and hoods." Following the 1561 statute where the Queen banned women from colleges during term time, in 1570 she willed that "no one shall go forth from his college except that he be clad in a gown, and a hood befitting his degree. A fine of 6 shillings and 8 shall be imposed on anyone who disobeys in this respect." A further decree in 1578 forbade hoses of unseemly greatness or disguised fashion, excessive ruffs, apparel of velvet or silk. So the delegation from the university, all clad in black gowns, possibly trimmed with sable, with black hats on their heads, probably seemed like they were dressed in Russian costume. So when Baron says, "Nor never more in Russian habit wait, I do forswear them, and I here protest. Henceforth my wing mind shall be expressed in russet yeas and honest kersey nose," Baron has given up his university gown and his vow to study, to woo his lady. The princess has been hunting and has shot a deer. Nathaniel, Holofernes and Dull argue about what age of deer was shot. Nathaniel says it was a buck of the first head. A buck of the first head is a 5-year-old fallow deer with a full set of antlers. In the Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, A buck of the first head is described as one who in debauchery surpasses his companions. Holofernes answers, "Hold credo, I don't believe it." Dull mistakenly replies it was not a hold credo, but a pricket, a doe being a female deer, and a pricket being a deer in its second year with 2 small spikes for antlers. Pompous Holofernes criticises Dull for his ignorance. Dull then tests them with a riddle. "You two are bookmen, can you tell me by your wit what was a month old at Cain's birth that is not 5 weeks old as yet?" Holofernes answers, "Dictina." Dictina, an uncommon title for Diana, is found in Goldin's translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. Nathaniel explains, a title to Phoebe, to Luna, to the moon. Dictina, also known as Britomart in Edmund Spenser's knightly epic The Fairy Queen, where she is an allegorical figure of the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. She is also known as Diana, the goddess of hunting. Dictina catches her prey with a net. After this diversion, Dull brings them back to the argument. "And I say, besides that, 'twas a pricket the princess killed." Holofernes decides to give in to Dull and makes up a poem. "The prayful princess pierced and pricked a pretty pleasing pricket. Some say a saw, but not a saw till now made, saw with shooting. The dogs did yell, put L to saw, then sorrel jumps from thicket. Or pricket saw, or else sorrel. The people fall a hooting. If saw be saw, then L to saw makes 50 saws a sorrel. The river Saw runs through Leicester. Therefore put L to saw, and you have Robert Dudley, the Queen's dear or darling. A buck of the first head, who was saw because of Elizabeth's rejection." When I first watched Love's Labour's Lost, the introduction of Holofernes and Nathaniel felt jarring to me. Quite late in the play, in Act 4, Scene 2, they arrive with their peculiar speech, which seems to add little to the plot of the play. In Love's Labour's Lost in Context, Part 1, they are barely discussed. They don't seem to fit with the French connection. So why are they there? Perhaps the company had parts for commedia-style actors, so the stock characters of Holofernes and Nathaniel were inserted. I suspect, though, that they make up the newly augmented part of the play and relate to the Nash-Harvey war of words. Gabriel Harvey was often described as a pedant. Harvey intersperses his English writing with Latin phrases. A third of Holofernes' lines contain Latin words or phrases. I have been trying to read as much as I can of Harvey's works and Nash's works, but it's a monumental task to read all of this stuff in depth and really try to understand it. In fact, Nash says in Have With You to Saffron Walden that Pierce, his supererogation, "Oh, 'tis an unconscionable vast gaubled volume, bigger bulked than a Dutch hoy, but it should seem that he is ashamed of the incomprehensible corpulency thereof himself. At the end of the 199th page he begins with 100 again, and to make it seem little. If I lie to you, you may look." I was fortunate to be able to borrow Pierce's supererogation from the library, and sure enough, page 199 is followed by page 100. It is possible to get an overview of the character of Gabriel Harvey and recognise him as the character Holofernes. He sees Nash as a juvenile, hence the character of Moth as a boy. Moth, M-O-T-H, reversed is Tom, T-H-O-M. Harvey himself tended to make enemies. He says of himself that outwardly teeth bite at him, but inwardly he never meant to cause offence. He says in the third of the 4 letters that the Earl of Oxford had been offended because someone, presumably Nash, had persuaded the Earl that Harvey's work, The Mirror of Tuscanismo, was directed at him. Harvey denies that Oxford was the subject of his work and refers to his gratitude to Oxford for giving him angels, that is, coins, each around £130 in today's money. I can't find any relationship between Will of Stratford and Gabriel Harvey. The most likely writer to allude to Gabriel Harvey in this way in Love's Labour's Lost is on the Nash-Lily side of the debate, and that would be the Earl of Oxford. Note the similarity between the Song of Vere from Summer's Last Will and Testament by Nash and the Spring and Winter songs in Act 5 of Love's Labour's Lost. Cuckoo, jug, jug, poo-wee, to-wit, to-woo. Lambs frisk and play, the shepherd's pipe all day. When shepherds pipe on oaten straws, mocks married men, for thus sings he, cuckoo, 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 O word of Vere. A big clue to the Earl of Oxford, whose fear of cuckoldry is a theme that we have discussed previously. At Audley End, Gabriel Harvey enjoyed dancing with the young ladies at court. In Act 3, Moth says to Amado, "Will you win your love with a French brawl?" referring to the popular French dance, the branle. In Have With You to Saffron Walden, Nash refers to Gabriel Harvey dancing at the Queen's 1578 visit to Audley End. He says, "I have a tale at my tongue's end of his hobby horse revelling and domineering at Audley End." In Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar, published in 1579, Hobinol, Gabriel Harvey, is in love with Colin, Spenser. So hobby horse would not only be a criticism of his style of dancing, but also pun on the name Hobinol. Moth says, "No, my complete master, but to jig off a tune at the tongue's end, or your hands in your pockets like a man after the old painting, then the hobby horse is forgot." In the play, Moth is referring to Amado's love being forgotten. The relationship between Spenser and Harvey is difficult to define. In the love shown by Hobinol to Colin in Shepherd's Calendar, 1579, does seem to be romantic love, and although the two remained friends throughout life, the initial closeness was forgotten. The picture of Harvey with his hands in his pockets appeared in Have With You to Saffron Walden. The 1598 newly augmented version of Love's Labour's Lost seems to echo the words of Thomas Nash's pamphlet about Harvey. In Gabriel Harvey's 4 letters, we find this sonnet with the lines, "With shortest of vowels and with longest of mutes." Harvey was particular about language and seems critical of those that use short vowels and mute consonants. Holofernes echoes these sentiments. "I abhor such fanatical fantasemes, such insociable and point-device companions, such rackers of orthography. As to speak doubt, fine, when he should say doubt, debt, when he should pronounce dept, D-E-B-T, not D-E-T. He cleppeth a calf, cough, half, hof. Neighbour, vocate, nebber. Nay, abbreviated to ne. This is abominable, which he would call abominable." In the second of the 4 letters, Harvey says this of Green. "Who has not heard of his dissolute and licentious living, his vainglorious and phasonical braving, his piperly extemporizing tarletanizing, his villainous coggling and foisting, his riotous and outrageous surfeiting, his impotent pamphleting, fantastical interluding?" Throughout his writing, Harvey employs long lists of insults. Look at the insults that Holofernes uses to describe Amado. "His humour is lofty, his discourse peremptory, his tongue filed, his eye ambitious, his gait majestical, and his general behaviour vain, ridiculous, and phasonical. He is too picked, too spruce, too affected, too odd, as it were, too peregrinate, as I may call it. What do you think is unusual about these insults? They are not the base, simple words that would usually be used to insult people. They do not even appear on No Sweat Shakespeare's insult generator list, apart from the monosyllabic vein. The use of long words used as insult seems to be a characteristic peculiar to Gabriel Harvey. In Act 4, Scene 2, Holofernes gives a misquote of Johannes Baptista Spagnola, known as Mantuan. Facil preco gelida quando peccas, omnia sub umbra ruminat. It could mean something like, I pray you are easily doing everything wrong in the cool shade. Ruminat, it ruminates, is left hanging. The quote is from Eclogue's 1498, which was the first poem in a standard grammar book, a quote that any grammar school boy might know. The correct line is, Faust preco gelida quando peccas omne sub umbra ruminat. I pray thee, Faustus, while the cattle chew in the cool shade they cud. This line from Mantuan has been recognised as a joke to have the pedant Holofernes say something silly to show his shallow understanding of Latin. On page 29 of Harvey's third letter, he addresses Piers Penniless' supplication to the high and mighty Prince of Darkness in the style of Tarleton's famous play, The 7 Deadly Sins. Harvey continues, I was very gently invited thereunto at Oxford. Vere, noble Oxford, Harvey says to Tarleton, you are to blame that dissemble with the world which caused Tarleton to leave abruptly. Harvey continues on line 28, referring to Piers Penniless. He tossed his imagination 1,000 ways, and I believe searched every corner of his grammar school wit, for his margin is deeply learned as Faust preco gelida, to see if he could find any means to relieve his estate. Throughout the third letter, Harvey seems to conflate Nash and Oxford into the one Piers Penniless. In one moment talking about a young man who was grammar school educated, and the next a noble earl who struggled to maintain his estate. A further clue to the identity of Piers Penniless is on page 32. Harvey refers to Mr. Churchyard, who was forced to hide in the doorway of a church because he was being chased for a debt for rooms and provisions that should have been paid for by his Lord Oxford. Harvey says that it was not lawlessness but lack of money that caused his situation. Harvey goes on to talk about Apuleius' ass, which I suspect was translated by Oxford. See Midsummer Night's Dream in context at around 26 minutes. There are other subtle clues to Oxford being the subject of this part of Harvey's third letter. Initially, I thought that Harvey was hoodwinked into believing the story about Robert Greene and the manner of his death, that he relays in the second letter. But reading further, I think that Harvey knew the truth. The elusive Thomas Nash took over from where the elusive Robert Greene left off. Harvey states that even though he requested a meeting with both men and hunted them down, he never met them in person. For more on this, see Bob Proctor on Nash, which I will link below. Could Tarleton's one-off one-hit wonder, The 7 Deadly Sins, also be the work of Oxford? And is Harvey giving us a clue? All this is fascinating, but let's get back to Love's Labour's Lost. From the likely candidates here, Francis Bacon, Philip and Mary Sidney, and Gabriel Harvey were friends. The most likely candidate to satirise Gabriel Harvey in this way is Oxford. There are so many allusions in this play that I have been unable to address them all. I am going to leave the last word with Harvey. I could sure dismask such a rich mummer, and record such 100 wise tales of memorable note, with such a smart moral as would undoubtedly make this pamphlet the vendablest book in London, and the Register one of the famousest authors in England. But I am none of these that utter all their learning at once, and the close man, may per case have some secret friends or respective acquaintance that in regard of his calling or in some private consideration would be loath to have his coat blazed or his satchel ransacked. I would like to dedicate this video to two men who will be greatly missed. The first, who needs no introduction to my viewers, Alexander, inspired me and encouraged me to continue this work to unmask the real Shakespeare. The other, my dad, who loved to recite snatches of poetry, encouraged me to have an inquiring mind. That's all from me on Love's Labours Lost. My thanks to my friends who have supported me. As always, I will leave links to the sources in the pinned comments below. Please like and subscribe, press the bell icon to be notified of the next video. I would really love to hear your comments, whether you agree or disagree. But remember, please be kind.